The airplane buzzed with the usual chatter of passengers finding their seats. But tension sliced through the air when a young black mother, holding her restless baby close, became the target of an arrogant flight attendant. She had done nothing more than ask politely for a small adjustment, yet the attendant's face twisted with irritation as if her very presence was an inconvenience. Without warning, in front of dozens of stunned eyes, the sharp crack of a hand landed across her face while she clutched her crying child. The sound echoed, freezing the cabin in horrified silence before whispers rippled like a storm through the rows. Shock turned quickly to outrage. Yet no one dared intervene, their eyes darting between the humiliated mother and the smirking attendant, who stood towering with misplaced authority. What no one knew was that this reckless act of cruelty had been witnessed by someone powerful, someone whose calm silence concealed a storm that was about to change everything. She sat frozen, her cheeks still burning from the strike, her arms trembling as she clutched her baby, who cried louder with every second. The sting of humiliation cut deeper than the slap itself, and though her tears slipped quietly down her face, the silence of the passengers around her made the pain heavier. They looked, they whispered, but fear sealed their lips, each person avoiding the risk of speaking against authority. The flight attendant, standing tall with a twisted sense of power, sneered as though punishing her was a triumph. Every second of that cruel display carved a wound not just in the heart of the mother, but in the very idea of justice. She lowered her eyes, wishing the earth would swallow her, unaware that hidden among those silent witnesses was someone who carried more power than the uniformed bully could ever imagine, and his silence was not weakness, but the quiet before a storm. Her tears had barely begun to dry when another pair of eyes, calm and steady, studied the scene with a sharpness that no one noticed. He was seated only a few rows behind, dressed simply like any other traveler, blending into the crowd so well that not a single passenger realized who he truly was. He had boarded early, quietly, his presence almost invisible to those around him, but nothing escaped his attention. He had seen the way the flight attendant's temper flared, the cruelty in her voice, and the slap that followed, a strike not only against his wife, but against her dignity as a woman and as a mother. His face revealed nothing, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, but inside his chest the fire of rage burned hotter with every second that passed. His silence was not surrender. It was calculation, for he knew that power used in haste loses its strength, and he had no intention of acting out of impulse. Instead, he let the scene unfold, watching the arrogance of the flight attendant, the cowardice of the passengers, and the quiet suffering of his wife. Each second was stored like evidence in his mind, each cruel smirk a nail in the coffin of the attendant's career. Each tear from his wife a blade that cut into his patience. The passengers avoided his eyes because they thought he was just another man, powerless, like them, a witness who would do nothing. The flight attendant, drunk on her moment of control, strutted down the aisle with the false confidence of someone who believed she owned the air in the cabin. But what she did not know was that her show of power had been staged before the wrong man. Beneath his calm surface was the weight of authority, wealth, and influence greater than anything she could imagine. He was not just a husband watching his wife be humiliated. He was the man who held the fate of every employee on that plane in his hands. Yet he sat quietly, concealing his identity, allowing the silence to build suspense, letting the humiliation of the moment grow heavy enough that when the truth finally came, it would strike harder than her hand ever had. His wife sat trembling, thinking she was alone, unaware that her pain was not just hers to bear, unaware that the man who promised her safety and love was watching, holding his rage like a storm trapped behind the clouds, waiting for the perfect moment to break. Nobody knew who he was, not the passengers, not the flight crew, not even the arrogant woman who had crossed a line that could never be erased. She had struck with her hand, but he would strike with power, and when he did, every soul on that plane would remember the moment they witnessed arrogance fall to its knees. The man sat still, his eyes never leaving the woman who had dared to humiliate his wife, but he made no sudden move. He did not shout, he did not rise, he did not betray the fury boiling within him. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the arrogance of the flight attendant grow, for arrogance always reveals itself when left unchecked. She walked the aisle with her head lifted high, glancing back at the mother as though she had won some private war, as though striking a defenseless woman holding a baby had somehow proven her strength. The passengers avoided her gaze, burying their faces into phones, magazines, and windows, pretending to be blind, though every one of them had seen the cruelty unfold. The husband watched this performance with the cold patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His stillness created a tension so thick it could be felt by anyone who looked at him long enough, but no one dared to. They thought he was simply another traveler, perhaps unsettled by the scene, perhaps too afraid to intervene. They did not know he was studying every detail, weighing every second, planning the moment that would shatter the illusion of the attendant's control. His silence was not weakness, it was suspense. A quiet build-up that held the weight of justice behind it. The attendant laughed with another crew member as if nothing had happened, her voice sharp and careless, dismissing the pain she had caused as though it were nothing but a minor inconvenience in her day. That laugh cut through the mother like a knife, but for her husband it was fuel, a reminder that cruelty often thrives in confidence, and confidence blinds the cruel to the danger waiting just out of sight. His wife sat trembling, her hands gently rocking the baby, her head lowered to hide her tears, unaware that her pain was about to be avenged in a way no one in that cabin could ever forget. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing something unspoken, as if the air itself had grown heavier, charged with anticipation of what might come. Some glanced at the man without realizing why they felt drawn to him, why his presence felt different, why his calmness seemed too deliberate. They could not place it, but their instincts whispered that he was not like them. He did not fidget, he did not hide, he did not look away. He only watched, and in his silence was a power none of them could name. The storm within him grew darker, ready to break, but he held it back, knowing that when he finally moved, when he finally spoke, the entire balance of the cabin would shift. For now he remained still, and in that stillness the suspense deepened because everyone, even without knowing who he was, could feel that something was coming, something that would change everything. The cabin was still echoing with gasps when the man's calm gaze shifted from the trembling flight attendant to his wife. Her eyes lowered, her dignity crushed by the slap that had shamed her in front of strangers. He stepped closer to her, lifted her chin gently, and spoke loudly enough for all to hear, his voice carrying not only authority, but also unshakable pride. He praised her for her strength, for her calmness in the face of humiliation, for the intelligence and grace she had always carried, even when others failed to see it. His words cut through the silence like a blade, and the passengers leaned forward, every ear waiting, every heart struck by the honesty in his tone. Then he turned back to the crew, his eyes locking on the manager who had been standing nearby in uneasy silence, watching everything but doing nothing. His voice was sharp now, not raised but laced with fire as he questioned why a woman of such intelligence and dignity had been reduced in their eyes to nothing more than a burden, why society was so quick to decide a person's worth by skin, by gender, by uniform. The manager stuttered, fumbling for an answer, his lips parting and closing without forming words, his face wet with nervous sweat, because he knew there was no explanation that could justify the injustice that had just unfolded in front of everyone. The truth was undeniable, and for the first time the passengers saw clearly how easily cruelty hid behind rules, how quickly respect was denied to those who looked different or stood lower in rank. Whispers spread again, but this time they carried shame and recognition, as though every person realized they too had been complicit in silence, letting fear guide them instead of justice. The husband's words struck harder than his title, exposing the rotten foundation on which the attendant's arrogance had stood. It was not just about one slap. It was about years of a world that judged a mother not by her heart but by her skin, not by her intelligence but by her position. He spoke of fairness, of humanity, of respect that every person deserved, and his voice turned the cabin into a courtroom where the verdict was already clear. The flight attendant's smirk had vanished, replaced by a trembling jaw and downcast eyes, her authority stripped bare before the very people she had sought to dominate. The manager's silence was a confession, and the passengers felt the weight of truth pressing against their chests, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable reality they had ignored. In that moment, the mother who had been slapped was no longer just a victim. She was the mirror reflecting society's failure, and her husband, standing tall beside her, became the voice of justice that demanded the world see her worth. The injustice had been exposed, and there was no way to cover it again. The air inside the cabin grew heavy as all eyes remained locked on the man who had just revealed his true identity. His wife sat frozen, still clutching her baby, while the passengers leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away from the scene that was unfolding before them. The husband took a slow step forward, his expression calm but his voice carrying the weight of thunder as he fixed his gaze on the flight attendant. "You dared to humiliate a mother." "In my airline." The words landed like a strike, sharp and final, echoing down the aisle so every single person felt them pierce the silence. The attendant, who only moments ago had strutted with pride, now stumbled back a step, her lips parting as if to explain, but no sound came out. Her arrogance drained from her face, leaving nothing but fear. The passengers, though silent, felt an undeniable spark of victory inside their chests, a collective cheer that vibrated through the cabin even if not a single voice was raised. They had all witnessed the injustice, had all sat in silence weighed down by fear, and now they watched justice rise in the form of the man who stood before them, unshaken, unstoppable. The flight attendant tried again to speak, stuttering, her words collapsing under the pressure of her guilt, but her excuses sounded thin even to herself, and she quickly fell silent, her eyes darting around for support that did not come. Not one of her fellow crew members stepped forward. Not one passenger looked at her with sympathy, for the truth had been laid bare, and no one could deny it. The husband did not raise his voice, did not need to, for his calmness was more terrifying than rage, his control more powerful than any threat. His wife looked up at him, a tear slipping down her cheek, but this time it was not a tear of humiliation. It was relief, the first sign of hope since the slap that had crushed her spirit. The passengers held their breath, waiting to see what would come next, their hearts pounding with the suspense of knowing they were watching a moment that would be remembered long after the flight had ended. The flight attendant's legs wavered beneath her, her face pale, her lips trembling as though she wanted to beg, but no words could erase the damage she had done. The husband's presence filled the aisle, his authority undeniable, and everyone knew the power had shifted completely. For the first time, justice no longer felt like a distant dream, felt present, alive, inevitable. And though the cabin remained silent, deep inside every passenger was cheering, grateful that the silence of the crowd had been broken by a single man's courage, a single man's power, a single man's voice demanding respect for the woman who should never have been humiliated. The moment the attendant was taken away, a strange hush lingered in the cabin. But underneath that silence, an invisible storm was forming. The mother sat quietly, her hands still trembling as she held her child, yet her eyes no longer showed weakness. Something inside her had shifted, and every passenger could sense it without a single word being spoken. The husband, firm and unyielding, stayed close by her side, his gaze sharp and commanding, daring anyone to challenge them again. The other attendants, who only moments earlier had ignored her pleas, now stumbled over each other in an attempt to offer water, blankets, and shallow apologies. But the damage was done, and the humiliation had already carved itself deep into the air like an unforgettable scar. What no one realized was that this silence was not the end, but the beginning of something larger, something that would extend beyond this flight. Justice had arrived, but justice often comes wrapped in shadows of revenge. As the plane cut through the night sky, whispers began to stir among the passengers, uneasy murmurs that carried both guilt and fear. They had all seen the way the mother was treated, and their silence made them complicit. Now they watched her with nervous eyes, as though she held a secret none of them were meant to know. The husband leaned close, whispering words that only she could hear, and the faintest curve touched her lips, not a smile of joy, but of resolve. It was the look of someone who had endured injustice for too long, and finally held the power to rewrite the ending. The captain himself entered the cabin, his voice low, offering apologies that sounded hollow against the weight of what had already happened. But when his eyes met the husband's, he faltered, the authority in his uniform suddenly shrinking before the quiet dominance that radiated from the man standing protectively beside his wife. Passengers exchanged glances, wondering who they really were, for their presence carried an unspoken power far greater than any title. The tension grew heavier with every passing second, as though the plane itself carried the burden of an untold truth. And then, with the simplest of gestures, the mother shifted her gaze toward the passengers who had once judged her so cruelly. No words left her lips, yet the weight of her stare cut through them like a blade, forcing them to confront the ugliness of their silence. It was a reckoning they could not escape, a reminder that injustice breeds consequences. The flight continued, but no one could shake the chilling sense that this moment would follow them long after they landed. For what began as humiliation had transformed into something darker, something unforgettable. The mother, once silenced and disrespected, now held the kind of power that no one dared to measure, and though she spoke nothing, every soul on that plane understood the truth. They had witnessed not just revenge, but the birth of a storm that would outlive them all. The cabin was silent for a heartbeat, before a wave of thunderous applause shook the air, passengers rising to their feet, their claps echoing like a verdict against the injustice they had just witnessed. The husband's grip on his wife's hand was firm, his whisper carrying more weight than the uniform of any attendant or the authority of any badge. No one would ever belittle her again. Not while he lived. The disgraced worker was gone, but the mark of his cruelty remained in the air, a reminder of how easily power can be abused when unchecked. Yet tonight justice had shifted its gaze. The powerless had risen, not with violence, but with unity and dignity, and the oppressor had been stripped of his false strength. As the plane steadied among the clouds, the truth lingered in every heart. Power means nothing if it cannot protect the powerless.